Something bad happens. Like that. Check. All right, that's not too bad. Hello, my name is Dylan. I'm giving the talk this evening. Just real quick. So Optoro is a reverse logistics company, which means we specialize in taking things from retailers and other online and in-person sellers and helping them find their next best home. We do a lot of cool stuff with Vue and Ruby. If you're interested in learning more about us, I definitely suggest checking out optoro.com/careers. So, without further ado, cool. So this talk is called Not Quite a Library. We're using components before you're sure how. Basically, we probably all as front-end engineers or people who are interested in the front end don't ever want to start from scratch, right? Just like in many things in software engineering, someone has probably done something like this before or solved the problem or thought about at least the problem that you're trying to solve before. And this talk is a little bit about getting those solutions into some sort of institutional memory. So who am I? Again, my name is Dylan. I've been at Optoro for about a year, and we've been using Vue for give or take about 6 months. Before that, I was at a couple of other smaller startups. I'm a Hack Reactor graduate, and I also worked at Hack Reactor. So if you're a bootcamp grad, I'm happy to talk to you about that. And just in general, I've been passionate about JavaScript for a few years, and ever since I've discovered Vue, I've really loved it and tried to embrace it. So today we're going to talk about a few things, right? We're going to start with what is a component library, like what is the concepts of kind of institutional memory when it comes to specifically front-end components and front-end like UX and usability. Why is it useful? Talking about choosing what goes in. Obviously, we don't want everything to go in, but there should be a review process. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll get into a little bit about component reusability, different strategies for sharing or putting up your library within the context of your organization, considerations for like building a larger component library at large, and then we'll get into some questions. So a couple disclaimers. I do assume that you have some knowledge of Vue.js for this talk. If you don't, that's totally fine. Feel free to raise your hand, stop me, ask questions, interrupt me at any point. I'm happy to answer any questions. The second thing is that I am bad at automated deployment, and this talk specifically deals with some things where that comes into play. And if you ask me specific questions about it, my answer might be honestly, I don't know. But there are a couple of people here who might be able to answer some of your questions. This talk is also what I'll call product organization centric. What I mean by that is just that we're gonna, since this talk is talking about organizations, we're taking the stance of, okay, we're at a product organization, we have a couple of core products, and we're going from that lens. That doesn't mean that this talk isn't applicable to something like an agency setting where maybe you're building lots of different front ends for lots of different clients. And in fact, it might actually be more applicable to that setting because you don't want to be building everything from scratch every time. So to get started, what is a component library, right? In a few words, I would define it as a place to put intentionally shared components. A component is a context-specific, encapsulated piece of front-end of code that is meant to run in the browser, right? And a library that's going to hold these components should answer a couple of questions, right? What do we have available? How do I, as an engineer who's trying to build a Vue application or some other kind of application, get to them, and how do they work, right? Fairly simple. You might have heard the terms UI library, pattern library. I'm talking about the same thing. They're very similar concepts. There are a couple of examples I have up here of really good component libraries. The first one is just Bootstrap Vue. Bootstrap Vue is a library, is a Vue component library that takes Bootstrap components and sort of extracts them and puts them into the context of Vue, obviously removing jQuery and allowing you to put Bootstrap markup, if you will, kind of extract that into your Vue application, right? So this is, in every sense, a component library, right? It answers the questions of what do I have available to me? That is really washed out. I'm not super sure about what to do to that. If there's anything you guys can't see, please feel free to just like flag me down because sorry. So that's sort of one example of a component library, right? Another example that I particularly like is actually even worse. Is Lonely Planet. Lonely Planet is a travel website where you can go and check out different locations, and people post things about like, oh, I had a really good time at this hotel or that hotel or whatnot, right? And they actually have a really great library of all of their JavaScript components. You can go in and publicly see like all the things that they use and they've built, and you can see it's like this is the markdown, this is what you pass to the JavaScript to get there, right? Yeah. There's a couple other ones that maybe are a little bit more famous. There's like Salesforce Lightning. This is an entire, almost a front-end framework specifically for building different applications in Salesforce, but they do, again, have like a very good list of, here are the components, here's how they're used, right? Here's the large amounts of thing that you can get out of them. Here are the different states that they can be in, right? This is, in essence, what I'm talking about. So there's another concept here that often comes into play when we're talking about component libraries, and that's a style guide. A style guide is defined, or I found a really great definition of a style guide here, that is, a style guide is a collection of pre-designed elements, graphics, and rules that designers or developers should follow to ensure that separate website pieces will be consistent and will create a cohesive experience at the end, right? If you, in the context of what we're talking about, a style guide is essentially, or can be thought of almost as a component library from the designer's perspective, right? How do I ensure a consistent and clean brand and UI across maybe multiple technology products or multiple technology offerings? That the way that comes into play when we're talking about components is that you're going to have design elements that have been established by your design team, and you're going to incorporate those design elements into your components, right? You don't want to have 30 different buttons, right? You want to have 5 buttons, and you want to use them in the way that the design team has intended you to. So those design elements will make up your components, but they're not necessarily the same thing as your components. Another point that I put up here is just things tend to get a little blurry when designers write code. If you're at an organization or you join an organization in which designers write HTML and CSS and kind of hand that to you rather than handing you mockups, this could get a little bit blurry because the design style guide can essentially look a lot like your component library. But the way I tend to think about it is those teams are approaching those things from different perspectives and have different invested interests in both of them and different goals they're trying to accomplish with them. Right? So why make a component library at all? Like, why should we do this? Right? First of all, like, we're just following decent coding standards. Don't repeat yourself. Right? Keep your code dry. If someone has gone through the trouble of making a really good component, there's no reason for you to rewrite it. Right? We should be using that again. And in fact, having a library at all facilitates, I find, reusability. Right? People think about how other people are going to use their components as they're writing them. If you have a place for them to go. If you don't have a place for them to go, people don't consider it, right? And so your components end up being less reusable and less useful to other people and other situations than they would be if you had a way, a pipeline for reusability at all. Another thing is more time in production, in the sense that if you have multiple technology products, and you have the same component in production with both of those products, it's essentially spending more time in production. You're more likely to catch bugs. You're more likely to upgrade a component or add functionality that's non-breaking, right? The more time it spends in the production, the more love it's going to get, and that's going to be better for everybody across offerings. It also eases the maintenance because you have multiple teams looking at this component, right? There may be some arguments back and forth about that, but what I would find is that if you have more than one team looking at it, if a bug is discovered, there are more stakeholders who are more willing to take the time to fix them if they're in more than one team's application, right? You also enable rapid prototyping, right? I don't know if anyone here has read Inspired. It's a book that's been going around Optoro recently, but it's all about sort of a different approach to product management, and that you want to get an actual working piece of software, even if it doesn't actually do anything, even if it's a total spoof, or the back end doesn't do anything. You want to get a working piece of software in front of a user as fast as possible. If you have a set of reusable components to draw from, you can pull up a prototype like that in a couple of days rather than a couple of weeks. It makes things really quick and easy. So the question of what should actually go into your library is kind of a delicate one, right? Because you want to facilitate reusability, you want to be able to get things in there that other people are going to benefit from, but at the same time, you don't want to fill your library with a bunch of one-off components that no one's ever going to touch again, right? So, there's a couple of different perspectives as to what should actually go into your library. What should you think about when you're adding things to your component library? There is a design perspective, right? You have your design elements that inform your components, right? If you have a consistent design element, if your design team has decided we have one search bar and this is what it looks like, that's a pretty good candidate for a reusable component, right? You want to ensure the same UX across different applications. There's the team perspective, right? If you have a component that someone has built, it's useful, and your designer or your product manager says like, hey, I know that so-and-so already built that, you should pull that in and use that in our application, right? That's a good candidate. You're also ensuring consistency across like maybe different product offerings or even just within the same product, right? From the perspective of actual pieces of code, if you're adding a non-breaking change, or if you're reusing somebody's component and you're adding a non-breaking change, there's no reason not to give that team that same functionality, right? That's a decent candidate for something that you would want to add to the library. And there's also the user perspective, right? Users expect things to work in the same way. If they see the same design component, if they see the same like input box, button, date picker, right? If it looks similar, they're going to expect it to work exactly the same way as somewhere else they've seen it on the website. There's no reason not to have consistency across the user experience. So there's a balance between the review process of getting things into your library and empowering everyone to contribute, right? You want everyone on your team on your different teams to feel like they can add something to the library, but you still want to review it, right? And if your team, if you're coming from a place where you don't already have something like this in place, you maybe don't have a mechanism for review already, right? I would suggest doing in that case is to use existing structures or mechanisms, right? If you have a set of principal developers or architects who already oversee these kind of decisions in your organizations, those are great people, those are great candidates for people who should be reviewing things that go in the library, right? If you have, but if you don't have something like that, if it's really sort of divided across teams or you're all in different areas, it's easy to set up some sort of loose organization, right? There's a joke here made a while ago that Optoro has kind of like a front-end cabal, right? And that's because we're all theoretically full stack, but some of us are more interested in others, right? And all we did was make like a GitHub team, and if you want to contribute something that moves towards front-end architecture, you just add that team, everyone sees the PR, and everyone can kind of comment and give their feedback on it, right? So for the rest of this talk, I'm going to introduce us to a particular lens, in which is that, congratulations, you're all now employees of Generic Product Company, Inc., right? So, and at our company, we have 3 core products. We have our to-do app, we have our to-do analytics application, and we have a document sharing application that are definitely not all the same pieces of code. So in conjunction with this, we have 3 product teams, and each product team is made up, they have their own designer, they have their own product manager, they have their own dev lead, right? They're pretty independent, they're pretty autonomous, they have different goals, right? And they have different front ends, and the front ends are deployed and built separately, right? But we do maintain a mono repo structure. So in our front ends repository, you have three applications. You have our to do analytics, and document sharing, right? So with that in mind, kind of moving that forward, let's talk about preparing components to get into the library. So a couple of things to keep in mind when you're preparing a component for reusability is you want to make sure you're removing obviously removing side effects, right? But that includes also style side effects, right? You don't want styling that's going to push or lay the component out in any way inside of the component. You want to allow anything that's composing this component to lay it out. You want to make sure that if you're doing things with Vuex, you don't necessarily want to assume that a reusable component is going to directly act upon the store, right? You would prefer to pass in props to that component. This is kind of a talk in and of itself. There have been many talks written about this actually. And so I'm not going to get too deep into it, but I am going to show an example of what I consider to be like good practices around this. So in here, can everyone see this? Is this large enough? All right. So in this example, right, we have our to-do app. Inside our to-do application, you have a couple of components. We have our whole page. We have our search bar. We have a to-do list, which is made up of to-do list items, right? And were we to kind of put this together, no, maybe? Right, we ended up with something that looks like this. Again, I apologize. I really do not know how to fix that. But if I can point out a few things, essentially you have a list of to-do items. You can check them off as done. And then there's just a little search bar down here where we can search for to-dos. Like, really simple, pretty easy. So diving into this here, the component that we're going to be reusing throughout this talk is our search bar, right? And a couple of things about the search bar is that it doesn't know what it's acting upon, right? Above it, you have our to-do list, and our to-do list is actually so the to-do list contains one search bar component. The search bar accepts one prop, which is a handle search function, which is defined within our to-do list. So the function that we pass in for handle search is search. All that accepts one search term. If the search term is empty, so if a user for some reason enters an empty search term, we simply just return the to-dos that we've loaded in from our API, right? If we do have a valid search term, all it does is filter out our current to-dos and return them, right? Very simple, very straightforward. I'm not trying to make these examples complicated. So all that the search bar actually does is that if a user presses enter, it calls the handle search function and hands whatever is in the search bar input into that function as a search term. Really simple, really clean. A couple of things to point out about this. The search bar pretty much avoids all side effects. It doesn't have any styles that are laying it out on the page. It's defining a width, but you might want to define a fixed width in a search bar depending on what your design team says. And all it does is really execute one prop that it's handed to it. It's pretty clean. It's pretty simple. It's not above the to-do list, for example, passing things into the to-do list. So these are just a couple of basic reusability concepts. So let's talk about strategies for sharing components like the search bar, right? Obviously, the example that I have here is like very contrived and very simple, but that doesn't mean that we wouldn't want to share it across our 3 different product offerings, right? It would make sense to use it for our users to have the same functionality in every search bar that they look at across our product offerings, particularly if we offer them like in a suite, for example, like the Google suite of products, like Drive, so forth, right? So one strategy that we can use within our mono repo is to use a shared folder. All we would need to do in this case is to have another directory within the folder and call it shared, right? And that all that would do is contain our shared components, right? We can make a standalone Vue component. There's a link in here to a really great repo that makes it pretty easy. And all you need at that point is an ES6 import statement to pull it into your project. So what does that look like? So like I said, we have our 3 applications in this example. You have To-Do Analytics, you have your To-Do app, and you have your document sharing application, right? Within our shared folder, we have one search bar that we've set up as a standalone component and that we've actually built and has its own dist folder. From there, if you go into any one of our components and look at our list, right? So for example, in our documents folder, it's a document list, right? We've pulled in our search bar and so I have a comment here that's just declaring a global component, right? The way that this is working is we're importing in our main file, we're importing the search bar from our shared folder, and then we're globally registering the component using view.component method, right? Again, really simple, really clean. And there are some significant advantages and disadvantages to this method, right? So the first advantage is that it's cheap, right? It essentially costs us nothing. All we did was add a component, or all we did was add a directory to our existing repository and we put things inside of it, right? Which makes it really quick as well, right? And essentially means that there's 0 maintenance. There's no separate sort of piece of architecture to look after. All the code is still in the same place, right? Given a README with a lot of links, you could really maintain a decent component library just within this folder without having to do a whole lot of other work, right? Smaller companies, really could essentially keep this going with a small number of team members for a very long time before they would actually need to think about any other sort of architecture for sharing components, right? It does have some downsides though. It's difficult to version. You could make up a directory of subdirectories with semantic versioning, but that would get a little tiresome, right? You theoretically couldn't share it outside of our monorepo architecture. Obviously you could copy and paste it, but that means that you don't really benefit from updates to that component, right? And not in like an automated way, right? And we don't want to create more work for ourselves. You also have a stronger potential for side effects in this way because you don't have versioning implemented. If you, let's say you do your due diligence, you run all the front end tests, you run all the back end tests, everything passes CI, right? And you deploy this, there's still some small possibility that there are side effects, right? Because if your application was theoretically bumping the version, but the other 2 product teams aren't super aware of that, we could be introducing side effects into the system. Also, this format, I find, doesn't really encourage documentation because there's nowhere that you can go that's particularly just like something hosted where you can see documentation laid out in a consistent way. We're not really encouraging other people to really document their components. Obviously there's room for a README within the file. Actually, this standalone component library that I used to generate this has a way for you to locally serve some documentation, but that's still adding some architecture to the system, right? We're not really enabling that through this method. The next way that we can share components consistently in a library would be NPM modules, right? Obviously that is our preferred, right? NPM install everything, and there are a couple of ways that you can do this. So the first is that if you create an organization with NPM you can, for free, put anything under your organization's umbrella and put as many components as you want in there. The caveat to this is that they're all public, right? Awesome Vue is just a nice long list on GitHub of awesome open source components, right? If you were trying to contribute to something like that, this would be an excellent way to do that. However, if you have anything proprietary in there at all, everyone now gets to see it, which means it's a non-starter for a lot of companies. If you're not someone like, I don't know, like a Red Hat that's building mostly open source things, you don't really want to just put all of your IP out on the internet for everyone to see. So it's not going to work for us here, at our organization or whatever. So the next option is to pay for NPM. If you pay for an organization on NPM, you can add unlimited private repositories for $7 per user per month. All that happens is your components come in under a scoped umbrella of that organization, and at that point you essentially have a place to put well-documented, easy to access components for as much as you want. Smaller companies in particular might find that option super appealing, right? If you have 15 engineers, $7 per user per month is super worth it to not have to build another thing and add it to your system and maintain it, right? As you start to get to a larger organization, maybe in the order of something like 30 to 40 engineers, that cost can become prohibitive, particularly if you have your own architecture, if you have an ops team that can facilitate additional services into your system and maintain them. Maybe that's not as appealing, right? And in that case, another option would be to host your own NPM repository. At Optoro, we actually do host our own NPM registry. And we use the first thing listed here. It's called VueDC. Both of these things have Docker images, and they're both free. They're both open source, and they're pretty easy to deploy for someone who knows what they're doing. All that this is doing is essentially setting up a mirror of NPM in order to configure you can configure the NPM CLI tool, You can configure the NPM CLI tool to look at your registry first and say, hey, is this component is this module that I'm looking for in my registry? And if it's not, it will go on and get it from the main NPM registry, right? So in this context, we have generic product company has its own private NPM organization, right? We have a search bar component, and in there we have a lot of documentation about how to use it, right? How to import it into a module, how to build. Right, and again, there's a couple of different ways to configure this. If you can't read that, basically what we're doing here is we're configuring our registry. If you are going to deploy a piece of architecture, oftentimes because access to the NPM registry is only required at build time, a lot of people will put this behind a VPN and allow essentially the development team to access it from there. So it doesn't need to be exposed to the internet, makes it very secure. And in that case, all that you would need to do is configure a registry locally for NPM. You can do this in a couple of ways. You can call npm config and set a registry, or you can actually just add an npm RC file to the root of the directory, and npm will know to look at your registry's URL, right? From that point on, if you want to publish components, you get an npm account, either with your registry or with the main npm registry, add your user, add your scope, and then it's really easy to pull down and install components from there, right? So let's look at some code. So in this example, we've added our search bar component, which doesn't actually change at all. Still the same source code. Instead of being within a shared folder, we can actually keep this somewhere else in a different repository that we're just going to call for right here in our intents and purposes our npm registry, right? As long and we build it, we can publish it to npm. And from there, it's really easy to access it, right? So across our 3 applications, right, if we look at our To-Do Analytics app, here we actually don't need to add anything to our main because ES6 imports know about everything that we add to our package.json. So in here, we've added a single dependency for our search bar, which is just scoped to our organization in NPM, the generic product company. And from there, it's really easy to pull in. You have a single import statement. And as long as you register the component properly with Vue, you can use it just like you normally would. So pros of it, there are obviously some pretty big advantages of this. You have version components. You don't need to bump the version across your product offerings all at the same time. It's really easy to say like, hey, like we're not ready to upgrade to that breaking change of this feature yet. Give us a minute and we'll add that into our maintenance schedule and we'll get that done. And then at this point, you're enabling maybe a more service-oriented architecture, in some cases where your front-end applications can live in separate repositories, and having them up in an actual registry really facilitates documentation. Simply because there's a place to put it, oftentimes people will fill up that documentation because they don't want to go to the repository and look at their component and see that there's just nothing there, right? Oftentimes that actually drives people to contribute more to documentation. Obviously, there are some downsides to this because either of these solutions require work or money, right? Either you need to pay more or you need to put something else into your architecture. You need to do more work on it. That means somebody at some point has to own it, somebody has to maintain it, right? So different solutions are going to work for different organizations. So from here, if we were to get to that point, right, if we were using NPM to store all our components, we had a list and some documentation of where they all were and how they all worked, we would have a fairly robust library at that point. But we could take it a step further, right? We could get to something like IBM's Carbon, where we saw at the beginning, where they had a public dedicated website talking about, or actually, I think I showed you guys Salesforce Lightning, a public dedicated website talking about their components, right? There might be reasons we want that, right? Salesforce uses that as a recruiting tool. They come in and say, look at our large library or our whole front-end framework that we're working with and that we've built out and that you could get to work on, right? So in that case, if we're gonna deploy a separate piece of software specifically to house our components and to document them, right? We have a couple of considerations that we want to think about. Do we want to build it or buy it? Like there is definitely a paid solution for this out there somewhere, right? There's someone who's willing to do this. But if you build it, you have to think about who's going to own it, right? Is this your ops team? Not really, like in some sense. You would want it to be owned by the front-end engineers. You would also want, in this case, living documentation or automated documentation, right? You would want a way to commit code that automatically gets pushed up to the main site so that component documentation is directly mirroring what the component is actually doing, right? You would want to automate your testing suite for this, right? If you're going to put 1,000 components into a library, you want all of the tests to run on all of them every time you deploy, right? Just like you would for production or for your production product application, right? And then, do we want this to be private versus public? Like again, having this whole thing being public, or at least the documentation for it, can be a very powerful recruiting tool or put your name out into the community. But that doesn't necessarily work for every company. And then we also want to consider the overhead, right? This is adding essentially another product to your suite of applications. And someone is gonna have to own and maintain and care for it, just like you do the rest of your products. If your company isn't maybe large, maybe it's not time to do that just yet. So kind of just to circle back, we talked a little bit about what a component library is, why it's useful, how to pick what goes in it, preparing components to get in there, as well as a couple of different strategies for sharing components across different products and considerations if you want to take it a step further and build a dedicated piece of software specifically to house your components. Right? Does anyone have any questions? I wouldn't start necessarily that small, because a lot of those things can be those in some senses are actually are design elements, right? If your company uses Bootstrap and Bootstrap is going to take Bootstrap presets are going to take care of setting those things for you, that's not necessarily the place to start. I would start with something with a little bit more functionality. Mm-hmm. What version of Angular? So then I would say, yeah, you could definitely deploy something very similar for Angular for this. You can definitely do something similar. You can actually take this maybe even a step further and abstract this away from a framework entirely and have an entire library of just web components, right? That's another thing you can do. I think actually Evan Yu is working on a package called Vue Web Components that is essentially taking Vue components and making them into web components that can be put into anything, right? Maybe that's what you want to put in your component library at the end of the day. Yeah.
Finally, decide on a standard for web components then?
That is very much still in flux. I don't think that.
Which one are you adhering to?
I'm not sure. I don't know enough about the project at this point. Sorry. Yeah.
Sort of walk through like a component-specific problem that you guys were like, oh, we got to make a bunch of components and it solved like a big problem. Can you use like a real-world example that you guys use?
Yeah. So, yeah, I can show you something. So one of the sites that we work on is called book.com. What you find a lot in e-commerce is that you want to lay out a bunch of things in a grid, right? You want to take, bulk.com sells pallets or cases of reused or excess or returned inventory, and this is specifically pointed at like other businesses, right? We're selling things that our clients return, and we're selling them out to other resellers, right? So a lot of times you'll come in and you'll look at and you say, oh, okay, like I want to see all of the pallets that you have containing like computers in Office, right? A really common use case for something like this is you would want to be able to fluctuate between a grid and a list, and then you want to have some sort of sorting or filtering, right? This is a really good use case for a reusable component, particularly since Vue has slots. You could theoretically make a grid where you could pass a list of things, a search function, a filter function, and have a couple of open slots for filters, right? And then essentially have a grid that's going to lay itself out and take care of all of that the same way every time, right? That's a pretty common use case for things in e-commerce, in terms of like, show me all of the things that I can buy and lay it out in a appealing way and allow me to sort and filter through it.
Component doesn't know what it's going to receive. It's just like, what to do with it.
Doesn't have to, right? Mm-hmm. Because like at a certain point you can take. How many people here are familiar with a slot in Vue? Who knows what I'm talking about when I say that? Right. So for those who aren't, and who may be coming from an older or a different framework where you can't just pass anything into a component, you have to kind of tell the component what it's going to get before you hand it to it. In Vue, you don't have to do that. You can declare what's called a slot, and in that slot, you can pass it essentially anything, and as long as you tell Vue how to behave towards that component, if that makes sense. I definitely recommend checking it out. They're really cool. Awesome.
So you guys decided on Redatio.
We did, yeah.
Any regrets? How does it compare with Nexus? Did you look at Nexus?
We did look at Nexus. We're in the process of considering maybe an upgrade because all of the things that are actually in our registry are in like a document storage. So we would be able, using Docker, to swap them out if we wanted to. With Redatio, there are some regrets. It is an open source project. It has, some maintainers and a decent community, but I don't think it's maintained in the same way that and it has the same kind of might behind it as Nexus. So there are some quirks for sure. Awesome. Well, thanks, guys.
Many thanks again to Dylan for hosting and the food. I'll be coordinating with Dylan to make sure you have to get all this stuff. It'll be on the repo so you guys can download the slides and whatnot. So
When's the next meetup?
it was March 13th.
I think so.
Yeah. Anyways, it'll be on our website. Check out Twitter, meetup.com. We update everything. So yeah, so feel free to just kind of chat and hang out. So yeah.
Awesome.
All right, thanks again, Dylan.
All right. Thanks again, everybody.